Section 7 of The Coming Race. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mary Rhodey. The Coming Race by Edward George Bulwer-Lytton. Chapter 12. The language of the Vril-ya is peculiarly interesting, because it seems to me to exhibit with great clearness the traces of the three main transitions through which language passes in attaining the perfection of form. One of the most illustrious of recent philologists, Max Muller, in arguing for the analogy between the strata of language and the strata of the earth, lays down this absolute dogma: quote, "No language can, by any possibility, be inflectional without having passed through the agglutinative and isolating stratum. No language can be agglutinative without clinging with its roots to the underlying stratum of isolation." End quote. On the Stratification of Language, page 20. Taking then the Chinese language as the best existing type of the original isolating stratum, quote, "as the faithful photograph of man in his leading strings, trying the muscles of his mind, groping his way, and so delighted with his first successful grasps that he repeats them again and again." End quote. Max Muller, page 3. We have, in the language of the Vril-ya, still clinging with its roots to the underlying stratum, the evidences of the original isolation. It abounds in monosyllables, which are the foundations of the language. The transition into the agglutinative form marks an epoch that must have gradually extended through ages, the written literature of which has only survived in a few fragments of symbolical mythology and certain pithy sentences which have passed into popular proverbs. With the extant literature of the Vril-ya, the inflectional stratum commences. No doubt at that time there must have operated concurrent causes in the fusion of races by some dominant people, and the rise of some great literary phenomena by which the form of language became arrested and fixed. As the inflectional stage prevailed over the agglutinative, it is surprising to see how much more boldly the original roots of the language project from the surface that conceals them. In the old fragments and proverbs of the preceding stage, the monosyllables which compose those roots vanish amidst words of enormous length, comprehending whole sentences from which no one part can be disentangled from the other and employed separately. But when the inflectional form of language became so far advanced as to have its scholars and grammarians, they seem to have united in extirpating all such polysynthetical or polysyllabic monsters as devouring invaders of the aboriginal forms. Words beyond 3 syllables became proscribed as barbarous, and in proportion as the language grew thus simplified, it increased in strength, in dignity, and in sweetness. Though now very compressed in sound, it gains in clearness by that compression. By a single letter, according to its position, they contrive to express all that with civilized nations in our upper world it takes the waste, sometimes of syllables, sometimes of sentences, to express. Let me here cite 1 or 2 instances. An, which I will translate man, ana, men. The letter S is with them a letter implying multitude, according to where it is placed. Sana means mankind, ansa, a multitude of men. The prefix of certain letters in their alphabet invariably denotes compound significations. For instance, gl, gl, which with them is a single letter, as th is a single letter with the Greeks, at the commencement of a word infers an assemblage or union of things, sometimes kindred, sometimes dissimilar, as un, a house, glun, a town, i.e. an assemblage of houses. Ata is sorrow, glata, a public calamity. Aur an is the health or well-being of a man, glauran, the well-being of the state, the good of the community. And a word constantly in their mouths is aglauran, which denotes their political creed, namely, that the first principle of a community is the good of all. Aub is invention, sila, a tone in music, glaubsila, as uniting the ideas of invention and of musical intonation, is the classical word for poetry, abbreviated in ordinary conversation to glaubs. Na, which with them is, like gl, but a single letter, always when an initial, implies something antagonistic to life or joy or comfort, resembling in this the Aryan root nak, expressive of perishing or destruction. Nax is darkness, gnarl, death, naria, sin or evil, nas, an uttermost condition of sin and evil, corruption. In writing, they deem it irreverent to express the Supreme Being by any special name. He is symbolized by what may be termed the hieroglyphic of a pyramid, //. In prayer they address him by a name which they deem too sacred to confide to a stranger, and I know it not. In conversation they generally use a periphrastic epithet, such as the all good. The letter V, symbolical of the inverted pyramid, where it is an initial, nearly always denotes excellence of power, as Vril, of which I have said so much, Vid, an immortal spirit, Vril-ya, immortality, Cum, pronounced like the Welsh cum, denotes something of hollowness. Cum itself is a cave, cum in, a hole, zicum, a valley, cum zi, vacancy or void, bodhacum, ignorance, literally knowledge void. Cum posh is their name for the government of the many, or the ascendancy of the most ignorant or hollow. Posh is an almost untranslatable idiom, implying, as the reader will see later, contempt. The closest rendering I can give to it is our slang term bosh, and this cum posh may be loosely rendered hollow bosh. But when democracy or cum posh degenerates from popular ignorance into that popular passion or ferocity which precedes its disease, as, to cite illustrations from the upper world, during the French reign of terror, or for the 50 years of the Roman Republic preceding the ascendancy of Augustus, their name for that state of things is glek nas. Ek is strife, glek the universal strife, nas, as I before said, is corruption or rot. Thus glek nas may be construed the universal strife rot. Their compounds are very expressive. Thus buddha being knowledge, and tu, a participle that implies the action of cautiously approaching, tu bodha is their word for philosophy. Pa is a contemptuous exclamation analogous to our idiom stuff and nonsense. Pa bodha, literally stuff and nonsense knowledge, is their term for futile and false philosophy, and applied to a species of metaphysical or speculative ratiocination formerly in vogue, which consisted in making inquiries that could not be answered, and were not worth making; such for instance as, why does an An have 5 toes to his feet instead of 4 or 6? Did the first An, created by the All Good, have the same number of toes as his descendants? In the form by which an An will be recognized by his friends in the future state of being, will he retain any toes at all, and if so, will they be material toes or spiritual toes? I take these illustrations of Pa-Bodh not in irony or jest, but because the very inquiries I name formed the subject of controversy by the latest cultivators of that science 4,000 years ago. In the declension of nouns I was informed that anciently there were 8 cases, one more than in the Sanskrit grammar. But the effect of time has been to reduce these cases, and multiply, instead of these varying terminations, explanatory propositions. At present, in the grammar submitted to my study, there were 4 cases to nouns, 3 having varying terminations, and the 4th a differing prefix. Singular, nominative, on, man; dative, ano, man; accusative, anan, man; vocative, hil-an, O man; plural, nominative, ana, men; dative, anoi, 2 men; accusative, ananda, men; vocative, hil-ananda, O men. In the elder inflectional literature the dual form existed. It has long been obsolete. The genitive case with them is also obsolete. The dative supplies its place. They say, "the house to a man," instead of "the house of a man." When used, sometimes in poetry, the genitive in the termination is the same as the nominative. So is the ablative, the preposition that marks it being a prefix or suffix at option, and generally decided by ear, according to the sound of the noun. It will be observed that the prefix hil marks the vocative case. It is always retained in addressing another, except in the most intimate domestic relations. Its omission would be considered rude, just as in our forms of speech in addressing a king it would have been deemed disrespectful to say king, and reverential to say O king. In fact, as they have no titles of honour, the vocative adjuration supplies the place of a title, and is given impartially to all. The prefix hil enters into the composition of words that imply distant communications, as Vril-ya, to travel. In the conjugation of their verbs, which is much too lengthy a subject to enter on here, the auxiliary verb ya, to go, which plays so considerable part in the Sanskrit, appears and performs a kindred office, as if it were a radical in some language from which both had descended. But another auxiliary or opposite signification also accompanies it and shares its labours, namely zi, to stay or repose. Thus ya enters into the future tense, and zi in the preterite of all verbs requiring auxiliaries. Yam, I shall go; Yiam, I may go; Yani ya, I shall go, literally, I go to go; Zampu yan, I have gone, literally, I rest from gone. Ya as a termination implies by analogy progress, movement, efflorescence. Z as a terminal denotes fixity, sometimes in a good sense, sometimes in a bad, according to the word with which it is coupled. Iva-zi, eternal goodness. Nan-zi, eternal evil. Pu, from, enters as a prefix to words that denote repugnance, or things from which we ought to be averse. Pu-pra, disgust. Pu-narya, falsehood, the vilest kind of evil. Poosh or posh I have already confessed to be untranslatable literally. It is an expression of contempt not unmixed with pity. This radical seems to have originated from inherent sympathy between the labial effort and the sentiment that impelled it, pu being an utterance in which the breath is exploded from the lips with more or less vehemence. On the other hand, z, when an initial, is with them a sound in which the breath is sucked inward, and thus zu, pronounced zu, which in their language is one letter, is the ordinary prefix to words that signify something that attracts, pleases, touches the heart, as zummer, lover, zutze, love, zuzulia, delight. This indrawn sound of z seems indeed naturally appropriate to fondness. Thus, even in our language, mothers say to their babies, in defiance of grammar, "Zoo, darling." And I have heard a learned professor at Boston call his wife (he had only been married a month) "Zoo, little pet." I cannot quit the subject, however, without observing by what slight changes in the dialects favoured by different tribes of the same race, the original signification and beauty of sounds may become confused and deformed. Z told me with much indignation that Zummer, lover, which in the way she uttered it, seemed slowly taken down to the very depths of her heart, was in some not very distant communities of the Vril-ya vitiated into a half hissing, half nasal, wholly disagreeable sound of subber. I thought to myself it only wanted the introduction of n before u to render it into an English word significant of the last quality an amorous Gy would desire in her Zummer. I will but mention another peculiarity in this language, which gives equal force and brevity to its forms of expressions. A is with them, as with us, the first letter of the alphabet, and is often used as a prefix word by itself to convey a complex idea of sovereignty or chiefdom, or presiding principle. For instance, Iva is goodness, Diva, goodness and happiness united, Adiva is unerring and absolute truth. I have already noticed the value of a in Aglauran, so in Vril, to whose properties they trace their present state of civilization, Avril denotes, as I have said, civilization itself. The philologist will have seen from the above how much the language of the Vril-ya is akin to the Aryan or Indo-Germanic. But, like all languages, it contains words and forms in which transfers from very opposite sources of speech have been taken. The very title of Tur, which they give to their supreme magistrate, indicates theft from a tongue akin to the Turanian. They say themselves that this is a foreign word borrowed from a title which their historical records show to have been borne by the chief of a nation with whom the ancestors of the Vril-ya were, in very remote periods, on friendly terms, but which has long become extinct, and they say that when, after the discovery of Vril, they remodelled their political institutions, they expressly adopted a title taken from an extinct race and a dead language for that of their chief magistrate, in order to avoid all titles for that office with which they had previous associations. Should life be spared to me, I may collect into systematic form such knowledge as I acquired of this language during my sojourn amongst the Vril-ya, but what I have already said will perhaps suffice to show to genuine philological students that a language which, preserving so many of the roots in the aboriginal form, and clearing from the immediate but transitory polysynthetical stage so many rude encumbrances, from popular ignorance into that popular passion or ferocity which precedes its disease, as, to cite illustrations from the upper world, during the French reign of terror, or for the 50 years of the Roman Republic preceding the ascendancy of Augustus. Their name for that state of things is gleknas. Ek is strife, glek the universal strife, nas, as I before said, is corruption or rot. Thus gleknas may be construed the universal strife rot. Their compounds are very expressive. That which the Ana have attained forbids the progressive cultivation of literature, especially in the two main divisions of fiction and history. I shall have occasion to show later. End of chapter 12.